Welcome to Beth Tikkun and this series called Spiritual Seasons. In these teachings, we dive into the weekly Torah portions by making connections to the pattern of salvation we see in the yearly calendar. This week we are in portion Vayikra, the first 5 chapters of Leviticus. As we do with each portion, we'll fit Vayikra into a pattern of yearly growth, and that pattern is salvation. Let's start by talking about the new month we have just entered, Wednesday night. It's important that we spend time on the month of Nissan and Rosh Chodesh Nissan, the beginning, first day of Nissan, because with Nissan we're beginning a new year of growth. The cycle is both coming to a close and beginning again. So one question we can be asking is, does Rosh Chodesh Nissan have a particularly strong connection to newness and beginnings, even more than the other new moons? I mean, all of the new moons are about a starting over, but does this one have a special connection to that idea? Turns out that although we don't mark the beginning of Nisan with a special holiday other than Rosh Chodesh, it truly is an especially important Rosh Chodesh. So let's start by pointing out that the month of Nisan is the subject of the first commandment given to the Jewish people as a whole while they are still in Egypt. That commandment is found in Exodus 12 and says, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So that is not the very first commandment, but it's the first one given to the Jewish people as a whole, which they developed as a people in Egypt. And so that's the first one to them as a people. And so Nisan is singled out here this month as having the honor of being the subject of that first commandment to the Jewish people. So beyond this, let's notice that Rosh Chodesh Nisan occurs at a very special moment in the year, the spring equinox. So this happened this year on Monday at exactly 5:24 Eastern Standard Time. At that moment, the direct rays of the sun were exactly on the equator, and day and night were balanced at 12 hours each everywhere on the planet. Now that we are several days later, the daylight is longer than the darkness by some minutes. So we're actually gaining about, in the northern hemisphere, 2 minutes and 45 seconds of daylight a day. So day is now dominating night. And that happens right here at Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So what does it mean that Rosh Chodesh Nisan coincides with this tipping point, at least in the northern hemisphere where most of the people live and where Israel is? Remember, when we're doing these geographic comparisons, we're mostly concerned with where Israel is, and it's in the northern hemisphere. So Israel is also tipping over into the dominance of day. So remember that the darkness indicates that God is hiding a bit, and the physical is being emphasized. The darkness is the time for the moon to dominate. It's the time for the bride to reflect back the light of the sun. The dark side of the year is associated with going into exile and the testing that refines the bride and gives her a chance to shine out in the darkness. Nisan, on the other hand, is a month dominated by the story of coming out of exile, the Passover story, which we tell right in the middle of the month of Nisan on the full moon of the month at the Seder. We are now moving into a time of miracle. So rather than God's hiddenness, we're moving into a time of miracle when God is less hidden and his protection and his leading are more obvious. The brightness of this summer side of the year is the context for a new stage of revelation. Revelation is connected to light and learning. So Nisan is a time to jump to the next level. So this is something God does for us, right? We can't really pick ourselves up to the next level by our own bootstraps. He has to help us in that. So we see this idea of jumping levels in the Hebrew word for Passover, Pesach, which is similar in meaning to the way the English sounds, Passover. The root Pasak means to hop or jump or skip over or to spare something. God jumps over the houses of Israel in Egypt with the last plague, and in the process, Israel is given the opportunity to jump to a higher level of relationship with him. So let's go back to the idea that the first commandment given to the people as a whole is that the month of Passover is to be regarded as the beginning of months. Why should this be such an important commandment? Truly, the implication of this commandment is profound. For one thing, the entire lunar solar calendar grows out of this commandment. The fact that the Jewish lunar calendar must be adjusted periodically for the solar calendar to keep Passover happening in the spring, right? So an extra Adar is added every now and then. But there's something much more profound. There's something deeper happening here. And so we have actually mentioned this before, but it bears repeating here. You know, we have to hear things multiple times before they sink in, really. And this is a very good teaching at this time of year, at the spring equinox. This is a good time to go over this again. So most cultures in the ancient Middle East celebrated the 7th month as the beginning of the year. And so why did they do that? Well, I'm not really sure, but I think that's kind of lost in history as to why that happened. But it might have to do with the pattern of night and day we see right from the beginning in Genesis 1. The 7th month is when the darkness begins to dominate the day, right? So the year is like the day. There's this half of the year dominated by darkness, half of it dominated by light, half of the day dominated by darkness, half of the day dominated by night. And so the 7th month is kind of the equivalent of the evening when it starts to get darker in the winter. And God established a pattern in Genesis 1. And that pattern is that the darkness comes before the day. And so that's why a Jewish day begins in the evening. God said, and there was evening, and there was morning, one day, Yom Echad. The darkness of evening is first. By saying this, God is establishing a natural order. So let me put emphasis on the word natural there. A natural order wherein the darkness leads the two halves that make the echad. Echad is things coming together to make a whole. Well, the one that you say first is sort of leading, and he says darkness first. So let me repeat that. In Genesis 1, God creates a natural order wherein darkness comes first. And so we see in the ancient Middle East that the fall comes first in their calendar, and then the spring comes second. And I would imagine that's the way it was for the ancient nation of Israel too. The 7th month is still called Rosh Hashanah, right? If that is the natural order, we need to ask, is the spiritual order the reverse? Do we have a precedent for that in the Word? Well, in fact, we do see the reverse order in Scripture at a very important place, and it's a place that's appropriate for the discussion of Vayikra. When God gives the commandment regarding the daily offering of the 2 lambs, this is what the text says. Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 lambs, a year old, day by day, regularly. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. The Tamid offering, this ongoing continual offering of these 2 lambs, is given according to the opposite reckoning of a day. First morning, then evening. In other words, the temple or the tabernacle works on a different reckoning of a day. The 2 daily offerings that are the heartbeat of the tabernacle and the temple are to happen in an opposite order to the natural order established at the beginning. The construction of the tabernacle and the beginning of the service there represents a reversal of the natural order. The service of the tabernacle is what redeemed people do, not people who are enslaved to the natural order in Egypt. So it's really quite breathtaking what God is doing here. He's taking the calendar established according to the natural order, and he's saying, this reckoning of the calendar is no longer suitable for a redeemed people. Now your year is to go from day to day rather than from night to night. At the very least, we can say that God is telling Israel to add this reckoning of months to the reckoning of the year, so that they function by both. And that is what we have seen happen with the two beginnings in the year, Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh Nissan. But I think God's emphasis here is that Israel is to be a people who live in the spiritual first and the physical reflection second. Remember, Nissan is associated with the spiritual and the miracle, and Tishrei with entering the physical and the darkness. And he's saying, put the spiritual first, right? We are people who transcend the physical now that we are redeemed, because we are a people who function according to the spiritual law first. What looks like a rather innocuous, not so important commandment about which month is first is really indicating that a massive flipping of worldview has happened. It's all buried there, just in that little verse there in Exodus. And we see this idea reflected in the meaning of the word Nissan. So, as I just said, Nes means miracle. Nissan is known as the month of miracles, and we can see all the miracles in the Passover story, right? God is so strong there in Egypt with the plagues and the coming out and the dividing of the water. And not to mention the miracles of renewal in nature in the spring. And miracle transcends the natural order. For redeemed people, the light of miracle comes first rather than the darkness of the natural. We don't live for the natural. We don't wake up and go to bed with the thought of how we can accumulate more stuff. We begin and end our day with the thought of how we can better serve. And the stuff is secondary and is beneficial only if it is in service to the spiritual goals. Otherwise, it's an enslaving trap, right? If it's stuff that we're contemplating, if it helps us with our spiritual goals, it's going to be life for us. If it's just stuff for the sake of stuff or pleasure, it's going to weigh us down. So connected to the miracles of this season is the idea that Nissan is a time for God to give us the gift of faith in Him. So there's another idea, the idea of faith coming in at Nissan. So Nissan is called the mitochondria of faith in the year. It's the wellspring of faith in the months. And the main way we receive this faith in our day, in our days today, is through the telling of what God has done for us. Right? We're not seeing God do these amazing miracles in Egypt. So in our day, we tell each other. This is the heart of the Passover Seder, the telling of what God has done for our spiritual ancestors. It is a time to pass along faith in God to both the children, they're emphasized in the Seder, the children are, and to the adults alike. Rabbi Trugman describes the night of the Seder as having a kind of electricity in the air. He says that for many Jewish people, many of their earliest memories are of Seders. So let me take a minute here to offer a practical suggestion for your Seder this year. At some point, pause in your recitation of the Haggadah and allow people to share how God has been working in their life, or how God did something special in the past, or how He did something for a parent or a grandparent, something miraculous even. It's good to personalize the Seder in that way. We are all to understand that we are personally coming out of Egypt that night. So it's good to personalize the redemption story. It helps to put faith in people as we speak these things to each other, including the children. The last point I'd like to make here, pertaining to the month of Nisan, is that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan in particular, we are mindful that we have arrived at a point of completion on the one hand, and we are already looking ahead to being recreated on the other hand, a whole new turn of the wheel. So the setting of the tabernacle on Rosh Hashanah, the setting up of the tabernacle, rather, on Rosh Chodesh Nissan, speaks to both of these ideas of arrival at a goal and beginning a new journey. Remember, God tells Moses, set that thing up on the first of Nissan, Rosh Chodesh Nissan. And so that's both an end point and it's a beginning. So the setting up of the tabernacle is the culmination of a year's worth of salvation, a year of walking with God out of Egypt into the wilderness, right? And Rabbi Trugman says that the setting up of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the beginning of the service there on Rosh Chodesh Nissan means that on that day, creation reaches a kind of fulfillment of what it is made for in the first place. The lower realm, down here, is to be a dwelling place for God, a place of intimate interaction between him and mankind and the rest of his creation as well. And so we see him coming to fill that tabernacle on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. But setting up the tabernacle is also a beginning of a new journey with God. So looking beyond the tabernacle, Rosh Chodesh Nissan is connected by Jewish tradition to the day of the creation of the world. There's a tradition that the universe was created on the first of Nisan. So there's a sense that this is a day that marks the beginning of not only creation, but also recreation. Every time we come to the first of Nisan, it's a day of recreation, right? We're being created again. There's actually a long debate in the Talmud and Tractate Rosh Hashanah about when the world was created, in the 7th month of Tishrei or the 1st month of Nisan. We've mentioned this story before. So after putting forward much evidence for both opinions, in the end, the sages cannot come to a conclusion. Eventually, though, along comes Rabbeinu Tam, who famously brings the two views together by saying that God created the world in thought, in Tishrei, in Rosh Hashanah, and in deed, in actuality, in Nisan. And Rabbi Trugman points out in support of Rabbeinu Tam that in the fall, right, creation in thought, the trees have just set their buds, but they're tiny. They are the potential for new life, new leaves. It is not until the spring that those leaves actually emerge and become visible. So we're seeing the thing actually come into the open in the spring. So the point here is that even as Rosh Chodesh Nissan is a kind of conclusion of a journey, it is also a day of recreation. The spring shows us clearly that this energy of rebirth is the energy that is flowing through the creation in a special way at this time. And this new life of spring is absolutely beautiful here in Ohio, where our seasons are very pronounced and our winter tends to drag out a bit. It just makes us appreciate spring all the more. The trees are just getting ready to leaf out right now. The air in the forest here is pregnant with new life. You might be able to say it that way. A point I want to make here is that a higher level is never a place to sit and relax, at least not for very long. Having arrived at a goal never means that we stop for good. When we get more light, and that's what's happening now, is a new light is beginning to shine, and he is shining that new light. Well, we can't be content with the shape of our lives because that new light illuminates us more deeply. And we see that there are still places within us where we are enslaved to the darkness. So it's a bit of a catch-22. The goal is the indwelling of God. But by that new light of his greater indwelling, we see that there is more work to be done. It's like, oh, great, God came and he's here with us. Oh, no, I got to clean up that corner. I got to clean up that corner. And we praise him for the revelation and trust that he who illuminated the darkness will help us to walk with him in faith into a greater freedom. When the tabernacle is inaugurated, God's Shekinah comes, and that is the new light for Israel. But it is also the beginning of a new journey where they approach the land of promise, and what happens? with those 12 spies that go in. 10 of them bring back the evil report. What's happening there? I'm connecting here God dwelling in the tabernacle to what happens with the report of the 10 spies. What is the report? It's the evil report. And that's how God is illuminating the next phase of the journey ahead. This is the work that you've got to do, Israel. It all starts here. In the same way that God fills the tabernacle at this time, right? We are called tabernacles, right? So God fills our own bodies with his presence in a new way at this time of year. It might not be something you can sense physically, but we have to trust that this is happening. He is filling us in a new way at this time of year. And by that light, we see that there is more work to be done. And we should praise him for that, because that's a new journey of growth that he's giving us. So on a very practical level, this month being connected to the energy of creation means that the faculty of speech is important and even empowered at this time. God created the world through his speech. He spoke, and it was. Therefore, this month is understood to be a good time to bring correction to our speech. This starts with speaking out what God has done for us and our ancestors, as we mentioned a minute ago. We should not only do that at Passover, but we should be making a special point to speak of what God has done for us this whole month, right? We got to use our mouth in the right way this month. That sets something for the year for us. Another suggestion for working on our speech this month was a little bit ironic. This is a good month to practice being silent, holding our tongue. This is a vast challenge for most of us. Take heart that God has designed the month of Nissan with a little extra help for learning how to control the tongue. So if you can be purposeful and growing in this kind of discipline this month, right? Do something every day to remind you of what you're working on and regarding your speech. So you might find that you are able to make more progress now with this than at any other time of year. So this is what it means to study the pattern of the year and to get into step with God's program. Right? We know where to put an emphasis when he's putting an emphasis. So let's turn now to the Torah portion. We're starting a new book, which we call in English Leviticus. In Hebrew, the name of the book is the same as the first portion of the book, which is Vayikra, which is the first word of the book. It means, and he called. Speaking of God calling to Moses, and he called to Moses from the tent of meeting, and he said to Moses, and on it goes. So for most people, the book of Leviticus is a slog. The English word Leviticus means of the Levites, which is somewhat appropriate because the book contains so many laws directly related to the priesthood. Although Vayikra can seem thick with laws that on the surface seem like they don't have little to do with us today, we need to resist the temptation to ignore it. Let me just skip past this to the good part, right? Many sources point out that Vayikra is the third of 5 books of the Torah, meaning that it is the middle book. And the middle is the central stem that the others branch out of, right? They're all supported by this middle book of Vayikra. So the Kehot Komish says that although Vayikra doesn't have a lot of dramatic action in the book, it is actually here that the real action takes place. The inner life of the individual soul and the soul of the community in their communion with God. So the Hebrew name Vayikra means that the heart of this book is God calling out to us. It might be composed of a great many laws, but at the heart of each of those laws is God calling out to us. When you call out to someone, you're asking them to draw near to you, and God can ask us to draw near to him because he first draws near to us. At the end of Exodus, God comes down from on high and he fills a humble tent made with human hands. That's God coming near to us. And from that tent, he calls out to us, Vayikra. He calls out. So let's turn now to the portion itself. The portion of Vayikra is a great example of how God is calling out to us through the commandments of the Torah, how he first draws near to us before he asks us to draw near to him. And it's also an example of how the book of Leviticus appears impenetrable on the surface. But just below the surface is the heart of God, right? You hit Vayikra and boom, you've hit a wall in some ways. But it's really God calling to us, and he's saying, and you can come to me through this. Vayikra is a description of the sacrificial system. By way of summarizing the portion, we'll briefly go over some of the details of the sacrifices, including the various types of sacrifices. So first of all, though, let me explain the Hebrew word that is used to describe the sacrifices in general. So I often prefer using the Hebrew with this topic, though I tend to switch back and forth. The word used in the second verse here for offering is korban. So it's used right at the beginning of the portions, introducing this whole section, and the word is korban, for sacrifice. In fact, the root of this word is used something like 18 times in this chapter because it's the same root for another important word here, the word for to bring. We bring a sacrifice. Well, that word is karav. To bring a sacrifice is yakriv korban, the same root used twice. And not only that, but the word for innards, like the intestines and all that is in there on the insides. It's from the same root, and that word is karev, and we find that word here in this chapter. So what does this root karav mean? It means to draw near. And that's very important to always keep in mind when we're reading about and thinking about the sacrificial system, the korbanot. It's about God drawing near to man and man drawing near to God, right? He calls out, Vayikra, and he says, come near. I've already come near to you. And so we see that in the korbanot. We can translate the idea of bringing a sacrifice as drawing near to offer a draw near, right? A korban. It's about closeness to God. So I will sometimes say korban or korbanot, which is the plural, for sacrifice or offering. And sometimes I'll just say sacrifice or offering. So just by way of setting the stage, understand that both Jewish men and women could bring any of the categories of korbanot. Gentiles were also allowed to bring a korban, but they could generally only bring whole burnt offerings. So let's summarize the categories now. These are all listed in the outline that is posted below the video, along with transliterations of the Hebrew names for each of these categories. So the two main types are animal sacrifices and the grain offerings. The grain offerings are composed of wheat or barley flour mixed with olive oil and frankincense. So the animal sacrifices are generally divided into 4 types or 4 groups. Only 5 types of animals could be sacrificed in these 4 different ways. All right, so there are 5 types of animals. They are oxen, sheep, goats, doves, and pigeons. And doves and pigeons are in the same family there. The 4 categories are the whole burnt offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. The whole burnt offering was entirely burned up except for the skin. The sin and guilt offerings were both partly burned on the altar and partly given to the priests, right? So whole burnt offering, whole thing burned up. Sin and guilt offerings, part goes to the priest and part goes to the altar. The peace offering goes in 3 directions. So part of it goes to the altar and is burned up there to God. Part goes to the priest, and then part goes to the one who is bringing the offering. So if you're bringing a peace offering, you will go home with some of that meat. But regardless, all of them, except for the olah, the whole burnt offering, will be eaten either by the priests, some of it will be eaten by either the priest or the one bringing the offering. So one thing to note here is that the first korbanot mentioned in Vayikra are not for sin and guilt. We so closely associate expiation of guilt with the sacrificial system. They're not the first mention, the sin offering and the guilt offering. They're only mentioned in the second half of the portion. So the separations of sin and guilt are not necessarily the primary reasons we are attempting to draw near to God through the korbanot. Maybe we just want to express thanks to God for something. Maybe we want to show gratitude for his provision. Or we want to say thank you for a rescue from a difficult situation. And yet, it could also be that sin has separated us from God, and so he also provides pathways to help deal with this issue as well. So a second point here, beyond saying that sin and guilt offerings aren't the first ones mentioned, is that we see a lot of complexity in the system of korbanot. And this complexity reflects several aspects of what the korbanot are doing. They are complex because one important level they picture is Yeshua's sacrifice. And that sacrifice is complex. What Yeshua was doing there on the cross had many aspects of taking on the curse, for example. And so if these sacrifices, these korbanot are reflecting that, well, then they are going to be complex as well. On another level, they are addressing the human soul. And the human soul is complex. And our motives for drawing near are also complex. And we can add into that the ways we can sin and become distant from God are also complex. And so there's a whole system for these many different situations. So I will share some more thoughts about the korbanot in general, but first I want to draw out our attention to an oddity in a handwritten Torah scroll, right? If we're looking at a handwritten scroll, because I think it has a lot of meaning, especially for believers in Yeshua. And so there's a small letter alef in the word Vayikra. It's the last letter of Vayikra. And much is said about this unusually small letter. The point that the rabbis usually make here is that the small alef refers to the humility of Moses, that Moses saw himself as small, like this little alef, before God and man in the right ways. And they go on and talk about what's proper modesty and humility. But as useful and good as that teaching is, I think the rabbis are missing something important here. The alef is first and foremost the letter that represents God. Here the rabbis are applying the letter to Moses, and that's not inappropriate. Adam's name begins with an alef. So the alef is also associated with man, who is made in the image of God. But when the rabbis explain the Jewish letters, they heavily emphasize that the alef is first symbolic of God. The letter is even described as the image of God. The word aluf means Lord and Master, and the alef is known as the Lord and Master of the Aleph Beit. Many of God's names begin with the aleph, like Adonai begins with an aleph. So if the aleph represents God, why is there a small aleph here in the word Vayikra? And he called. How do we connect together? We're going to try to connect together three ideas here. God calling to us, God making himself small, and the korbanot, which is the subject of Torah portion Vayikra. So it's pretty clear. You don't have to think too hard if you're a believer to put those three things together. God calls out to mankind by becoming small in the form of Yeshua, who was sacrificed on our behalf in order to draw us close to God. So let me say that again. God calls out to mankind, that's the word Vayikra, by becoming small in the form of Yeshua, the letter aleph is small, who was sacrificed on our behalf in order to draw us close to God, right? He is made small in his sacrifice, and that draws us near to God, and that is the subject of Torah portion Vayikra. So it's an amazing bit of ancient wisdom to make this letter alef, small in this first word of the book of Vayikra, it says, once again, that God reaches out to us first. God makes himself small first before expecting us to make ourselves small as we reach for him. And we can say that God does this first because we know that Yeshua is the lamb slain from the foundation of the earth, right before everything. That is when God makes himself small. So Romans 5 says, "For while we were still weak, at the right time, Messiah died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were sinners, Messiah died for us." So the small aleph of Vayikra speaks to us of Yeshua's sacrifice, which comes first. Therefore, we are called to also make our lives a living sacrifice. And I think one day humanity will be called again to do more than just making our lives a living sacrifice, but doing the actual sacrifices, the korbanot. I'd like to suggest a general idea now for how we should approach the whole idea of the korbanot. How do we draw near to God through, sacrificing an animal, right? How does that draw us near to God? So it just seems so foreign to us. And I'd like to present this idea that we should think about bringing a korban in the same way that we think about baptism at conversion. It's the physical capstone on a movement of the Spirit, an internal movement. The real weight of the moment is found in the decision, but God gives us a physical pathway through which we are able to express our minds and hearts and get the thing moving in the physical realm. Because this marking of the moment in the physical, it's super important to us. So he gives us this physical moment to go along with the spiritual one. He knows us because he designed us. He knows what we need to make solid and fixed and certain a movement of the Spirit. We know that when we decide to follow the Lord, that's chiefly an internal matter, a matter of the heart, a decision, an activation of the will. We might immediately express that decision through a prayer in which we tell God that we are turning away from the ways of the world and submitting to him as king, right? We're making him king. But what quickly follows that prayer is the physical reflection, the baptism that pictures what has just happened inside of us, the physical picture of dying to the old life and being raised to the new. So in the same way, when we have decided to draw near to God for whatever reason, this is a spiritual matter. We are filled with thanksgiving, or we want to acknowledge God's provision through first fruits, or maybe we have sinned and are filled with repentance. These are firstly matters of the inner person, the spirit. That is where the real weight is. But the inside must always have a physical outside to reflect it. And we've been talking about this in recent teachings. And God gives us specific physical pathways for expressing what is going on inside of us in the form of various korbanot and all of the commandments, really. If what is going on inside is repentance, first we get on our knees, like King David did, and we repent before the Lord, and we trust him for forgiveness in that moment, knowing that forgiveness rests upon Yeshua's sacrifice, right? It's not going to rest on the korbanot at the temple. We get on our knees, and we trust that he will forgive us if we're sincere. And so this is all largely inward, what's going on in that moment on our knees. But then in his graciousness, God has also given us the physical pathway by which we begin to make manifest our repentance and his forgiveness, and that is a sin sacrifice. And we bring that korban, and we go away with a solid sense that we have been forgiven through the sacrifice of Yeshua, and our relationship with God is restored. Where did the weight of that restoration lie? It was not in the physical pathway, but the spiritual. So I'm not saying that the korbanot affect our forgiveness. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the true substance is happening elsewhere. It's in what David did before the Lord. It's in that expressing of your heart to him and what Yeshua does to cover us. The substance of the reconnection happens on the knees. It's founded upon the work of Yeshua. But does the physical pathway also help us move forward? Most certainly it does. As Grant often says, we are hybrid creatures, amphibians, half spiritual and half physical. The physical reflection speaks powerfully to us not only of Yeshua's sacrifice for us, but also of how we give ourselves completely to God. There's a lot going on in that physical reflection. It's teaching us a lot. It's showing us a lot. In the same way that Yeshua surrendered his body, right? We're looking at that animal. It is a moment in which a person's senses, right? The physical senses would be filled full with the weight of sin, the greatness of Yeshua, the need to surrender the flesh, so much. But it's nearly wordless. It's a quiet ritual. It's a time for the body to absorb the sight of the violence of death and the flow of the blood and the sound of the knife and the smell of the fire. And all of that does its work to cement the matters of the heart and mind. So in a marriage, the two must give of themselves completely. This is more than just a mental exercise. It's spirit, soul, and body. The korbanot are the very foundation of how God gives everything to humanity, including the body, through Yeshua. And they are likewise foundational to how we also give ourselves to him, right? We do a lot of things to give our physical being to God. And we can count the korbanot among those. It's a powerful one that he's given us. As a final topic here, directly related to the korbanot, let's make a connection to the calendar here. Why are we reading about korbanot at this time in the year as we start a new cycle of months? So part of the answer here has to be that the foundation of all salvation is the death of Yeshua. The whole cycle of recreation to come rests on the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world, and his blood shed for us. And one of the main lessons we draw from his death is that we must also follow him in death. And this is what we are about to be called to do in Nissan. If we are to receive new life, we must put to death the old life. And so this is beautifully pictured, not only in the korbanot, but also in the image of matzah, the unleavened bread, which is so central to this month. Matzah is another picture of this need to empty out the old life. We must submit to death, right? This is what happens at the beginning of a new cycle of growth. And this death is especially connected to the animal soul, the nephesh, which the sages say is what we are particularly working on during the counting of the Omer, which begins in Nissan. So here now in Vayikra, we are seeing pictures of animals being put to death, the same animals that were worshipped in Egypt. So why are we reading Vayikra right now? All this about animals dying? It's because we're being called to put away the old life right now so God can fill us with a new one. Let's move forward now and make one more point connected to Yeshua. There are some who say that since Yeshua is the substance of the sacrificial system, why would we even bother with the reestablishing the sacrificial system? The korbanot strike us as barbaric, though that couldn't be further from the truth, right? For an animal to be used and to be deemed worthy of being a sacrifice, a perfect animal, that's the highest completion of that animal's life. It's not a barbaric thing. But if the system of korbanot are the shadow of Yeshua's sacrifice, why do we need them now? So part of what I said earlier speaks to that question, the idea that God gives us the korbanot as a physical pathway for us to begin manifesting physically, the desire of our heart to draw near to God. But there's a bit more to say here. First, let's note that the Bible is clear that the korbanot will be reestablished. Grant and Robin, in their talk this week, point to Jeremiah 33 on this topic of the restoration of the sacrificial system in the future. It says there that not only will the korbanot continue, but if we can break God's covenant with day and night, so that, and that's the order, by the way, day and night, so that they don't come when they are supposed to come, then God will break his covenant with the Levitical priesthood. So in other words, it's not going to happen. We can't break God's covenant with day and night. And so God says, look, if you could break that, then I'll let you break my covenant with the Levites. Well, it's not going to happen. So you see, though the korbanot are but shadows of the real thing, which is Yeshua, we live in a shadowlands, right? And we need the shadows. Who are we to say that any shadow that God gives us is obsolete, especially shadows as important as these that sit at the very center of his Torah? How foolish to think that we can decide that gifts of God meant for relationship with him are no longer valid or necessary. The earthly shadows reflect the heavenly reality, and that is true for every shadow down here. The earthly high priest reflects the heavenly high priest. Do we decide to do away with him for that reason? The shadows don't only teach us and affect us by making tangible the spiritual reality, they also establish a balance in creation that is God's design. God has designed it that the spiritual reality be reflected in the physical realm. So who are we to say we can do away with this reflection? It's not needed anymore. It's just arrogance. If God designed it to reflect, let it reflect. And may the temple be rebuilt soon and in our days. Well, lastly, now let's turn our attentions to Joshua chapters 15 to 17. In chapter 15, we see the allotment for Judah spelled out, along with Caleb's special inheritance within Judah. After getting Joshua's blessing in the last chapter, Caleb drives out the giants living in Hebron, and he also captures a place called Debir. And I believe it's Debir where Caleb asks for someone else to step up and conquer Debir. It looks like he himself conquers Hebron. Chapter 16 and 17 deal with the allotment to the sons of Joseph. At the end of chapter 17, the sons of Joseph complain that the hill country is too small for them, and Joshua tells them to clear the Canaanites out of the valleys in their territories and settle them. They respond that they have iron chariots down there, and they're too strong. And Joshua answers back that they will indeed drive out the Canaanites despite their iron chariots. So I'd like to make a few quick points here. The first is that in the same way that the sacrificial system is complex, partly because it reflects the complexity of the human soul, in this section of Joshua, we are seeing a complexity within the land that reflects the soul of the nation. If the land is the body for the soul is the people of Israel. And the soul is complex. So here it is represented as having 12 main sections, the 12 tribes, or 13, depending on how you're counting. And the complexities of the soul are reflected in the body as all these place names, these boundaries. And Grant has often taught us that the human body is complex because our souls are complex. And Tim mentioned that within the body you have real boundaries, and a lot of complexity. So here in these chapters of Joshua, as in the system of korbanot, we're getting a window into that complexity. So thank goodness we don't have to know everything about how our bodies work to be able to use them. We'd all be lost. We'd be a lost cause if we had to understand ourselves like that. And yet God has also enabled us to open the book and start learning about the body. And each day, science learns more and more. We have discovered wonders in these bodies, and we will never get to the bottom of it. So the second point I'd like to make here is that Caleb is a mensch, and we need to be encouraged by his example. The more we see of him, the more we come to respect him as upright, wholehearted, and brave. At this point in the story, he is old, so why should he get up the nerve to fight the giants in Hebron? And here's the real connection to today's teaching in Vayikra. We must never give in to the idea that we have come far enough. If we are still breathing, we must still be taking down the giants in our lives. It's just part of living. And we can't let the evil one tell us that we are too old to grow or that we don't have the energy left to change. If God has left us in the game for another spin of the wheel, then he will give us what we need to continue climbing with him. I'm using a lot of metaphors there. So if I die during this next season or the one after, God forbid, I'm going to die climbing. Let me die with my tools in my hand, right? We got to keep changing. Lastly, I'd like to make a point here about the house of Joseph fearing the Canaanites in the valleys and their iron chariots. How much had they seen of God's faithfulness in battle already, and yet they still doubted? I think the individual tribes struggled to clear their territories, because it's one thing to fight with a large group in which everyone is absolutely submitted to a strong leader. And it's another thing to grow up and fight on your own when that strong leader retires and passes on the torch. God is always calling us to step up to a life of higher faith. It's not a journey for the faint of heart. Joshua had many gifts, and people listened to him because God's anointing on him and preparation of him were clear. Joshua was near to Moses, and Moses was near to God. But God's way is that as we grow, his hand is a bit less obvious, and his selected leaders are perhaps only shadows of the original leaders. And this is by design. And so the people are called to trust God in what looks to be a less secure situation. So you can imagine the warriors of Joseph's tribes saying, I'm happy to go to battle under Joshua because I know God is with him. But our own tribal leaders don't hold a candle to him. And in that moment, the voice of Amalek comes back to haunt us. Is God with us or not? How can Joseph be doubting after seeing God work in such a mighty way? It's because Amalek is always lurking. And when Amalek begins to murmur in the darkness like that, we destroy him. And we say, God is with us. And we take out the sword and charge forward at the enemies who seem so rooted in their valleys. You know, it doesn't matter that those leaders don't compare to Joshua. God is with us. So here we go. Well, we'll leave it with that thought today. Thanks for listening. As I mentioned before, I've posted a link to an outline below the video. May God make us people who embrace the call to grow again. And we embrace that with excitement and joy. May he help us to be people who can control our tongues. May we be a people who respond to his drawing near to us by drawing near to him. And may he make us into the people he wants us to be. Shalom.